Do you remember when the story of David and Goliath first entered your mind? Perhaps you were still a child, sitting on the floor of a Sunday school room while an adult arranged small figures on a felt board. There was the shepherd in a plain robe. There was the armored giant. There was the stream, the sling, and the 5 stones. Before you were old enough to examine the story, you had already been told what it meant. Strength was unnecessary. Size did not matter. And faith alone could allow a powerless boy to defeat an impossible enemy. That interpretation may have remained inside you for years. It became more than a biblical memory. It became a pattern through which you understood courage, adversity, and divine favor. Whenever someone spoke of an underdog confronting overwhelming power, the names returned automatically: David and Goliath. But what happens when a story that has shaped your imagination begins to divide under careful examination? What happens when the text itself contains another name for the man who killed Goliath? What happens when the giant changes height depending on which manuscript you read? What happens when a king fails to recognize a servant he supposedly loved and appointed as his personal armor-bearer? And what happens when nearly half of the familiar chapter is absent from an older version of the story? These are not attacks arriving from outside the Bible. They are tensions within the surviving texts themselves. They remain visible because the editors who preserved these traditions never completely concealed the places where one version was joined to another. Baruch Spinoza understood the importance of such seams. He recognized that a text should not be protected from examination merely because generations have declared it sacred. If truth belongs to the order of nature, then truth cannot be injured by honest investigation. Only illusions require protection from evidence. Spinoza's method was not to begin with rage, mockery, or contempt. He began by observing. He compared passages. He noticed repetitions. He examined chronology. He asked whether the words on the page behaved like the work of one timeless author, or like a human archive assembled from different memories, political needs, and historical periods. That same method can be applied to the story of David and Goliath. There are 7 fractures in this famous narrative, 7 places where the familiar childhood version becomes difficult, perhaps impossible, to preserve in its traditional form. The first fracture appears in a verse that is rarely mentioned when the story is preached. 2 Samuel 21:19 names a different killer. In the Masoretic Hebrew text, the man who strikes down Goliath is not David. He is Elhanan, the son of Jaare-Oregim, a Bethlehemite. The verse identifies the location of the conflict, the identity of the warrior, his family connection, and the weapon of the Philistine he killed. The description is unmistakably familiar. The enemy is called Goliath the Gittite. His spear shaft is compared to a weaver's beam, the same memorable description associated with Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. This is not a vague reference to an unnamed giant. It is not an anonymous Philistine who merely resembles Goliath. The text supplies the same name, the same ethnic identification, and the same distinctive weapon. The verse creates a disturbing possibility. Perhaps Elhanan killed Goliath, and the achievement was later transferred to David. Or perhaps 2 separate traditions developed, one connecting the victory to Elhanan and another connecting it to David. Both traditions survived, and the editors who assembled the biblical material preserved them without fully resolving the contradiction. Either possibility changes the nature of the story. The Book of Chronicles, written later, appears to recognize the difficulty. Its version changes the object of Elhanan's victory. Elhanan no longer kills Goliath. Instead, he kills Lami, described as Goliath's brother. The contradiction seems to disappear, but the solution creates another question. Why does this brother emerge only when a later writer needs to protect David's claim to the victory? The Hebrew wording is especially revealing. The name Lami closely resembles part of the phrase used to describe Elhanan as a Bethlehemite. This has led many scholars to suspect that a textual phrase was reorganized, producing a new character whose existence solved an old embarrassment. Within this explanation, the later chronicler did not preserve an independent memory of Goliath's forgotten brother. He harmonized an inherited contradiction. This is how institutions often respond when 2 respected traditions cannot both remain literally true. They do not always discard one. They reinterpret one until the conflict appears less severe. Spinoza would ask us to observe the operation without first condemning it. Human beings desire coherence. We are disturbed when an admired figure loses a defining achievement. A king's legend, once connected to national identity, cannot easily be surrendered. The mind therefore searches for a way to preserve both the authority of the text and the fame of the hero. But explanation must follow evidence, not desire. If we decide in advance that David must have killed Goliath, then every contradiction will be forced to serve that conclusion. A brother may be created, a phrase may be retranslated, or a footnote may quietly redirect attention. Yet if we begin only with the surviving texts, the simpler reconstruction may be that Elhanan's victory belonged to an older tradition, and that the deed gradually migrated toward the more famous royal figure. This process is not unusual in the formation of legend. Stories gather around power. An obscure warrior may perform an extraordinary act, but the memory of that act has less cultural force than the name of a king. As traditions are repeated, copied, celebrated, and placed within national history, the achievement of the forgotten man can become the achievement of the famous one. The event is not necessarily erased, it is absorbed. Elhanan remains in the text like a buried foundation visible beneath a later monument. His name is still present, attached to the killing of Goliath, surviving in a passage that the larger tradition could not completely remove. Consider what this means. One of the most influential images in Western religious culture, the young David standing over the defeated giant, may contain the victory of another man. The heroic act may have been detached from an obscure Bethlehemite and placed inside the origin story of a future king. The statues, paintings, sermons, and children's illustrations would then represent not a transparent historical memory, but the final form of a long political and literary transformation. Most Sunday school teachers never knew this. Most parents who repeated the story were not hiding evidence. They inherited a polished narrative and passed it forward with sincere intentions. But scholars had seen the difficulty for generations. The contradiction remained in commentaries, academic editions, and footnotes, while the simplified version continued to move from pulpit to classroom and from parent to child. Why? Because the simplified version performs a function. It inspires, it comforts, it transforms political memory into a universal lesson. It gives the powerless a symbol and the faithful a miracle. But a story can be emotionally useful and historically constructed at the same time. Recognizing that possibility is the beginning of intellectual maturity. It does not require hatred toward the people who taught the story. It requires only the courage to distinguish between the meaning a culture later gives a narrative and the purpose for which that narrative may originally have been formed. And once we admit that the identity of Goliath's killer may have shifted, another question becomes unavoidable. What else changed while the story was being transmitted? The answer begins with the body of the giant himself, because Goliath did not merely acquire a different killer. Over the centuries, he also grew. The second fracture concerns a number. Numbers appear precise. They create the impression that interpretation has ended. A person may debate symbolism, theology, or intention, but a measurement seems to belong to the stable world of fact. Goliath, many readers were told, stood 6 cubits in a span. Depending on how the ancient measurement is calculated, this produces a man approximately 9 feet and 9 inches tall, nearly 10 feet. Such a figure would exceed the height of the tallest reliably documented human beings. He would not appear merely unusual. He would appear almost outside the natural limits of humanity. That extraordinary height gives the story much of its emotional force. David is not simply facing a trained soldier. He is facing something monstrous. The difference between them is made so extreme that ordinary causality seems insufficient. Victory must therefore be explained through divine intervention. But the nearly 10-foot Goliath belongs to the later textual tradition. Older witnesses give a different measurement. The Greek Septuagint describes him as 4 cubits and a span. The Dead Sea Scroll manuscript, known as 4Q Samuel, preserves the same shorter reading. Josephus also reports this smaller measurement. 4 cubits and a span places Goliath near 6 feet 9 inches. He would still have been exceptionally tall in the ancient world. He would have looked imposing beside the average soldier. His armor, confidence, and battlefield experience could easily have terrified an opposing army. But he would have been human. He would have resembled a very tall, modern athlete rather than a creature from myth. 3 feet separate the older Goliath from the later one. That difference cannot be dismissed as a minor scribal variation. The height of the opponent determines the entire emotional scale of the confrontation. A duel against a 6'9" warrior is dangerous and memorable. A duel against a nearly 10-foot giant becomes supernatural theater. Somewhere in the history of transmission, the giant expanded. Perhaps one copyist misread a numeral. Perhaps an oral tradition grew more dramatic before being written. Perhaps later scribes preferred the larger measurement because it strengthened the story's theological impact. We may not be able to identify the exact hand responsible, but the manuscripts allow us to observe the result. The Goliath known to millions of children is taller than the Goliath preserved in the older textual witnesses. This matters beyond a dispute about ancient measurements. It reveals something about the human imagination. When a story is repeated, its details do not always remain still. Communities emphasize what serves the function of the narrative. If the purpose is to display miraculous victory, the enemy must become increasingly impossible. The greater the obstacle, the greater the apparent proof of divine favor. A formidable warrior becomes a giant. A giant becomes a monster. A victory in battle becomes an event that appears to suspend the normal order of nature. Spinoza would invite us to resist the temptation to call an event miraculous merely because we do not understand its causes. For him, nature does not divide into ordinary events and supernatural interruptions. Everything follows from the same infinite order. An event may astonish us because our knowledge is limited, but astonishment reveals the limits of the observer, not a break in causality. A sling was not a toy. In trained hands, it was a dangerous projectile weapon. A stone launched at high speed toward an exposed face could injure or kill a soldier, regardless of his height. If David was skilled with such a weapon, his victory need not have violated nature. But a natural victory is less useful for myth-making than an impossible one. The later story, therefore, creates a larger contrast. A child against a monster, faith against armor, divine election against visible power. This is why the textual growth of Goliath is philosophically important. The question is not merely, how tall was he? The deeper question is, why did the tradition need him to become taller? What emotional or political purpose was served by increasing the impossibility of David's victory? Human beings often measure the greatness of a hero by the size of the enemy he defeats. We exaggerate the obstacle so that the triumph appears more meaningful. This happens in family stories, national history, political biographies, and religious traditions. The founder was not simply poor. He had nothing. The leader was not merely opposed. The entire world stood against him. The nation did not simply win a war. It survived certain annihilation. The exaggeration may begin as admiration, but repeated admiration can slowly become false memory. And because the resulting legend satisfies an emotional need, later generations defend it as though their own identity depended on its literal accuracy. Ask yourself how often this occurs in your personal life. Have you ever made an old enemy more powerful in memory, so that your survival appeared more heroic? Have you ever enlarged a past hardship until it became the central explanation of who you are? The imagination does not always lie deliberately. Often, it reorganizes memory according to present desire. A community can do the same. The nearly 10-foot Goliath tells the community what it wants to believe about David. No ordinary ability could explain his rise. He must have been chosen. But when we return to the older manuscripts, the giant becomes smaller, and the event becomes more understandable. That does not make the victory meaningless. It changes the kind of meaning we are permitted to assign to it. A skilled warrior defeating a taller opponent may demonstrate courage, timing, intelligence, and tactical advantage. It does not necessarily prove that the future king was selected by the ruler of the universe. The difference between those interpretations is enormous. One belongs to human history. The other legitimizes sacred kingship. Once we see the height change, we are forced to confront the instability of every other dramatic detail. If 3 feet can appear during transmission, what else may have expanded? Which speeches grew longer? Which motives became purer? Which coincidences were transformed into signs? The story begins to behave not like a fixed object delivered complete from heaven, but like a river, carrying material from every landscape through which it passes. The river remains recognizable, but it is never composed of exactly the same water. This brings us to the third fracture. Even if we temporarily accept that David killed Goliath, and even if we accept one of the competing measurements, we encounter a contradiction that does not require ancient languages or archaeological knowledge to recognize. You only need to read 2 chapters in sequence. In one chapter, King Saul knows David intimately. In the next, Saul looks directly at him and asks who he is. 1 Samuel 16 introduces David at the royal court. Saul is tormented, and his servants recommend a musician. David is selected. He comes before the king, plays for him, and earns his affection. The text states that Saul loved David greatly. It also says that Saul made David his armor-bearer. This was not a ceremonial title given to an invisible stranger. An armor-bearer occupied a position of trust near the ruler. He handled weapons. He accompanied the king. He stood within the dangerous and intimate world of royal warfare. David was therefore not a face Saul might easily forget. He was a daily presence. Then comes 1 Samuel 17. David enters the battlefield, approaches Goliath, and prepares for the duel. Saul watches him and asks Abner, the commander of the army, whose son the young man is. Abner does not know. After the victory, David is brought before Saul with the head of the Philistine, and Saul again asks about his family. The king who supposedly loved David does not identify him. The general who should have known the king's armor-bearer does not identify him. How can both chapters describe one continuous sequence? Traditional harmonizations propose that Saul recognized David but did not know his father. Perhaps the king wanted information about David's family because the victor had been promised privileges. Perhaps Saul's declining mental condition affected his memory. These explanations are possible only because readers feel obligated to preserve continuity, but they do not remove the structural problem. The second story introduces David as though the royal court has never met him. His brothers treat him as an inexperienced intruder. Saul questions his ability. David must describe his encounters with lions and bears to prove that he can fight. Everything functions as a new origin story. The simplest explanation is not that every character simultaneously forgot him. The simplest explanation is that two versions of David's rise were placed beside one another, and the manuscripts will soon show us just how visible that act of stitching became. One tradition presents David as a court musician, a capable man, and a trusted royal servant. Another introduces him as an unknown shepherd who arrives from Bethlehem carrying food for his brothers. In the first tradition, David already belongs to Saul's world. In the second, he breaks into that world through the spectacular defeat of Goliath. Each story can stand alone. The contradiction emerges because both were preserved. Imagine two portraits painted by different artists. One depicts a mature warrior already dressed for court. The other depicts an untested youth stepping out of obscurity. If the portraits hang separately, each creates a coherent image. But if someone cuts them in half and joins the pieces, the body no longer aligns. That is what happens between 1 Samuel 16 and 17. The seam is visible in Saul's confusion. As children, many readers noticed it without possessing the language to explain it. A small doubt appeared. Did Saul not already know David? But when adults continued reading without hesitation, the child assumed the problem belonged to the child. Perhaps there was a forgotten detail. Perhaps sacred books were too profound to question. Perhaps confusion itself was evidence of personal failure. This is one of the quiet ways authority operates. It does not always prohibit questions explicitly. Sometimes it merely behaves as if no question exists. The observer learns to distrust his own perception. Spinoza refused that surrender. Born in Amsterdam into a Portuguese Jewish community, he was still a young man when his independence of thought brought severe consequences. In 1656, at the age of 23, he was expelled from his religious community through an unusually harsh declaration of excommunication. The condemnation did more than reject his ideas. It attempted to isolate his entire person. Members of the community were instructed not to approach him closely, speak with him, read his writings, or offer him ordinary social contact. Yet Spinoza continued to think. He lived quietly, supported himself partly through work associated with lens-making, and declined opportunities that might have required intellectual compromise. His life became an example of what philosophical freedom costs when institutions depend on inherited certainty. Spinoza's biblical criticism was dangerous because it was methodical. He did not merely announce that Scripture contained errors. He asked who wrote particular books, when they were written, what political conditions shaped them, and whether the texts showed signs of multiple authorship. He noticed that Moses was described in the third person. He observed passages narrating events after Moses' death. He compared laws, repetitions, contradictions, and shifts in vocabulary. His central challenge was simple. Read Scripture according to the same principles used to understand any historical document. Study its language. Examine its context. Compare its versions. Do not begin by declaring what the text must be. Begin by asking what the evidence shows it to have become. Applied to David and Goliath, that method reveals not merely a contradiction between chapters, but a difference between manuscript traditions. This is the fourth fracture. A substantial portion of 1 Samuel 17 in the later Hebrew form is absent from the shorter Greek version preserved in the Septuagint. The difference is not a missing word or damaged sentence. Approximately 27 of the chapter's 58 verses do not appear in the shorter Greek narrative. The omissions amount to roughly 44% of the familiar chapter. Among the absent passages are verses 12 through 31, verse 41, portions of verse 48, verse 50, and verses 55 through 58. The consequences are immediate. Verses 12 through 31 contain the second introduction of David as the son of Jesse who moves between Saul's court and his father's sheep. They include his journey to deliver food, his conversations with soldiers, his conflict with his older brother, and his growing interest in the reward promised to the man who defeats Goliath. Verses 55 through 58 contain Saul's failure to recognize him. Remove those sections, and the contradiction largely disappears. The shorter version assumes the David already introduced in chapter 16. He belongs to Saul's court. He confronts Goliath without requiring an elaborate second origin story. Saul does not turn to Abner and ask the identity of the young warrior. The narrative becomes leaner. It also becomes more coherent. This manuscript difference is crucial because it provides physical evidence for the existence of multiple forms of the story. The theory of editorial combination is not invented solely to explain an awkward reading. Different textual traditions actually preserve different lengths. One version contains the expanded shepherd narrative. Another does not. Scholars debate which readings represent the earliest recoverable form at particular points, and the transmission history of Samuel is complex. But the broader fact remains. The David and Goliath story circulated in significantly different forms. The chapter was not frozen. It developed. A later editor or textual tradition appears to have preserved additional material, perhaps derived from another account of David's rise. Instead of eliminating one version, the tradition combined them. Think of a tree onto which a second branch has been grafted. The graft may survive. It may even produce fruit. Over time, most observers may assume it has always belonged to the original trunk. But at the point of attachment, the textures differ. The expanded story supplies everything the royal legend needs: the humble family, the skeptical brothers, the delivery of provisions, the innocent questions, the dramatic emergence from obscurity, and the astonishment of the king. It is a superior narrative. It is easier to preach. It is more emotionally satisfying than the story of an established warrior performing a dangerous military act. That may be precisely why it survived so powerfully. The human mind does not preserve information only because it is accurate. It preserves what can be remembered, repeated, symbolized, and used. A plain report says that a royal servant killed a tall Philistine. A legend says that an unnoticed shepherd entered a valley. No soldier dared to cross, and altered the destiny of a nation with one stone. Which version will parents repeat? Which will painters choose? Which will be placed before children? The expanded narrative possesses what the shorter one lacks: transformation. David moves from invisibility to recognition. The audience experiences the pleasure of reversal. The insignificant becomes central. The mocked younger brother becomes the savior of the army. That structure is emotionally irresistible. But emotional power cannot determine historical priority. Spinoza's philosophy asks us to understand why we cling to a version before deciding whether the version is true. We are often attached not to evidence, but to the effect a belief produces in us. The shepherd story tells us that weakness may secretly contain greatness. That message may comfort us when we feel ignored. It may therefore become psychologically painful to discover that the shepherd material is absent from an older textual form. But pain does not refute evidence. It reveals attachment. Understanding the cause of that attachment gives us greater freedom. We can preserve the insight that courage does not depend on social status, without pretending that every detail of the narrative arrived unchanged from the earliest period. A symbol may remain meaningful after its history is understood. What must be surrendered is not meaning itself, but innocence about how meaning was manufactured. The expanded chapter was passed through generations as though it were a single, seamless account. Yet the shorter manuscript tradition allows us to watch the seam appear, and once the added material is recognized, another detail begins to look different. After Goliath is killed, the story sends his severed head to Jerusalem. That destination appears natural only if we forget when the battle supposedly occurred. The fifth fracture occupies a single verse. After David defeats the Philistine, 1 Samuel 17:54 states that he takes Goliath's head to Jerusalem while placing the giant's weapons in his tent. To a later reader, Jerusalem appears inevitable. It is the city of David, the political and religious center of Judah, the location associated with the temple, the dynasty, and the sacred history that follows. Where else would the trophy of David's greatest early victory belong? But within the chronology of the story, Jerusalem is not yet David's city. It is not even under Israelite control. At this point, Jerusalem remains a Jebusite stronghold. David captures it only later, after becoming king, in the events described in 2 Samuel 5. The conquest occurs years after the confrontation with Goliath. The exact timeline can be debated, but the sequence cannot. David defeats Goliath before he rules from Jerusalem. The verse, therefore, asks us to imagine a young man from Bethlehem carrying the severed head of a Philistine warrior into a foreign-controlled city that he will not conquer until much later. Why would he do this? The text offers no explanation. Traditional interpreters have proposed that David carried the head toward Jerusalem, perhaps displaying it in the region, or that he preserved the trophy and brought it to the city years later. But the verse does not say, toward Jerusalem. It does not say, many years afterward. It places the destination directly after the battle. The difficulty becomes easier to understand when we stop imagining that the story was recorded immediately by an eyewitness. A writer or editor living in a later period would naturally associate David with Jerusalem. From that later perspective, Jerusalem was the proper symbolic location for the trophy. The city had become inseparable from the Davidic identity. The editor projected the later world backward. This happens frequently in historical storytelling. People describe past events using borders, names, institutions, and political meanings familiar to their own time. A modern writer may speak of a person traveling through a country that did not yet exist under that name. A family may say an ancestor was born in a town whose boundaries were established decades later. Such language does not always arise from deliberate deception. Memory organizes the past through present categories. But in a text presented as precise sacred history, the anachronism becomes a clue. It suggests that the narrative passed through hands, separated from the supposed event by time, changing political realities and established national symbols. Jerusalem was not merely a geographical location to the later editors. It was the center of legitimacy. By placing Goliath's head there, the narrative connects David's first great victory to the city that would later define his reign. The trophy appears almost like a prophetic deposit. The future king symbolically claims the city before he possesses it. This is powerful literature, but it is difficult history. The distinction matters. When readers confuse literary symbolism with eyewitness reporting, every meaningful detail becomes evidence of miraculous design. When readers understand editorial perspective, the same detail reveals how later communities organized the memory of their founder. Spinoza's approach would again direct us toward causes. Why does the head go to Jerusalem? Not necessarily because a young David actually carried it there after the duel, but because later Davidic tradition could hardly imagine his defining victory belonging anywhere else. The city exerts gravitational force upon the legend. Just as famous deeds migrate toward famous heroes, sacred trophies migrate toward sacred capitals. The storyteller does not merely record space. He arranges space according to political meaning. At this point, 5 fractures have appeared. First, 2 Samuel names Elhanan as the killer of Goliath. Second, the older textual witnesses describe a Goliath approximately 3 feet shorter than the giant of the later Hebrew tradition. Third, Saul fails to recognize the man who had already served him as musician and armor-bearer. Fourth, nearly 44% of the familiar chapter is absent from the shorter Greek form, including the passages that create the second introduction and recognition problem. Fifth, the narrative sends Goliath's head into a city David has not yet conquered. These are not 7 unrelated accidents. A pattern is forming. Different traditions have accumulated around David. Details have grown. Chronologies have been compressed. Political symbols from a later age have entered an earlier setting. The story looks increasingly like a layered composition. But the 6th fracture reaches deeper than any previous contradiction because it changes the identity of David himself. Was he an inexperienced shepherd boy? Or was he already a recognized warrior? 1 Samuel 16:18 describes David using the Hebrew expression times gibber kayil. The phrase can refer to a mighty man, a man of valor, or a capable warrior. In the same description, David is called skillful in music, prudent in speech, handsome, and a man of war. This portrait is not of a helpless child. It presents a young man whose abilities are already known. Someone at court has heard of him. His reputation is sufficient for royal service. Saul receives him, values him, and appoints him as armor-bearer. Then, in the next chapter, Saul tells David that he cannot fight Goliath because he is only a youth, while the Philistine has been a warrior from an early age. David must justify himself by describing how he defended sheep against predators. The experienced man of war disappears. In his place stands an untested shepherd. The contradiction is not peripheral. It concerns the central meaning of the duel. If David is already a warrior, his willingness to fight is courageous, but understandable. If he is an inexperienced child, the victory becomes evidence of extraordinary divine favor. One version belongs to military biography. The other belongs to sacred legend. The two images cannot be combined without altering the meaning of both. Defenders sometimes argue that the phrase describing David as a warrior refers only to potential, reputation, or general courage. Perhaps he was called a man of war without having extensive battlefield experience. But this attempt reveals the pressure placed upon interpretation. The reader must weaken the plain force of chapter 16 so that chapter 17 can remain intact. A more economical explanation is that different traditions describe David differently. In one, his rise was based on ability. He entered royal service because he was already impressive. In another, his rise began with a miracle. He was unknown until faith elevated him. Why preserve both? Because each version served a different need. The warrior justified David politically. A founder of a dynasty should appear capable of command, courage, and violence. His rise should not seem absurd. The shepherd justified David theologically. A divinely chosen ruler should emerge from humility. His success should exceed every natural expectation. Political legitimacy required competence. Religious legitimacy required election. The combined text gave David both. He could be the powerful man who deserved the throne and the powerless boy whom God alone raised to it. The contradiction was not removed because both portraits were valuable. This is a common feature of political mythology. The ideal ruler is simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. He comes from the people, yet he is unlike them. He is humble enough to represent the weak, but powerful enough to dominate rivals. His achievements prove personal ability, while his improbable rise proves divine favor. The historical person cannot always satisfy every requirement. Legend completes the image. And in the case of David, the shepherd boy was not merely an inspiring addition. He belonged to an ancient pattern of royal storytelling. To understand the seventh and final fracture, we must look beyond Israel and examine how kings throughout the ancient Near East explained why they deserved to rule. The sixth truth destroys the simple contrast most people remember. The familiar story depends on David being unqualified. His brothers dismiss him. Saul doubts him. Goliath despises him. David possesses neither armor nor formal military power. His apparent weakness becomes the stage upon which divine choice is displayed. But the David of chapter 16 already carries the language of qualification. He is known as capable, courageous, articulate, musically gifted, attractive, favored, and connected to warfare. He does not emerge from complete obscurity in chapter 17 because he has already entered the royal court. This older portrait does not require the same miracle. A trained or experienced fighter using a projectile weapon against a larger infantryman is not an impossible event. It is a tactical confrontation. The sling gives David range. Goliath's armor gives him weight but may restrict speed. The Philistine prepares for close combat, while David attacks before close combat begins. From the perspective of natural causality, the victory becomes intelligible. And that is precisely the problem for a legend intended to demonstrate election. If David wins because he is skilled, the event reveals David's ability. If David wins, despite lacking every relevant qualification, the event reveals God's preference for David. The later theological version must therefore remove ordinary explanations. David cannot be a proven warrior. He cannot depend on Saul's armor. He cannot defeat Goliath through conventional force. Everything that might allow the audience to attribute victory to natural ability is stripped away until only divine favor appears to remain. This is not accidental storytelling. It is ideological design. Spinoza understood that religious imagination often works by removing causes. When people do not know why something happened, they attribute the event to an invisible intention. The less they understand, the more confidently they may speak of providence. A storm destroys one house and leaves another standing. The surviving family calls itself protected. A leader wins an unlikely battle and calls himself chosen. A dynasty rises through alliance, violence, chance, and strategy, then describes its success as the will of heaven. Ignorance of causes becomes evidence of purpose. The shepherd version of David functions in this way. By concealing or replacing the causes that could make his victory understandable, the story creates a space where divine selection can be inserted. The boy is not merely brave, he is chosen. The stone is not merely effective, it is guided. The rise of David is not merely political, it is necessary within a sacred order. But necessity, for Spinoza, means something very different. Everything follows from causes. Human beings are not exceptions to nature. Their desires, decisions, fears, alliances, and victories emerge from conditions that can, at least in principle, be investigated. A king's rise may involve personal charisma, military skill, tribal conflict, dynastic weakness, marriage, patronage, geography, and the support of competing factions. To call the rise divine without examining these causes is not deeper understanding. It is the abandonment of understanding. Yet such abandonment can be politically useful. If David gained power through human causes, then his rule remains open to human judgment. His decisions may be questioned. His dynasty may be challenged. Another capable leader may claim equal legitimacy. But if God selected David before the eyes of the nation, resistance becomes rebellion against the structure of reality itself. The shepherd story, therefore, performs more than a devotional function. It converts political success into metaphysical entitlement. David does not merely become king. He is revealed as the king nature, or, in the language of the tradition, God has already chosen. This helps explain why the text preserves two Davids. The warrior David explains how the historical figure could survive and rise. The shepherd David explains why no one should question the dynasty formed in his name. One satisfies probability. The other sanctifies authority. When the traditions are combined, the reader receives both without being encouraged to distinguish them. For centuries, most audiences encountered only the theological function. The warrior description was passed over quickly, while the image of the shepherd dominated preaching, art, and children's education. Why? Because the shepherd can be universalized. Every frightened child can imagine holding the sling. Every struggling believer can identify a personal Goliath. Every preacher can transform the ancient political narrative into a lesson about faith. The warrior cannot be universalized so easily. Most people are not trained soldiers. Most listeners cannot identify with a royal armor-bearer performing a military act. But everyone has felt small. The shepherd version enters that feeling and offers triumph. Its psychological power is genuine. Yet psychological power can conceal historical function. A medicine may relieve pain while also preventing us from noticing what caused the wound. In the same way, a consoling interpretation may help the listener endure hardship while diverting attention from the political work performed by the narrative. This does not mean courage is false. It means the lesson about courage may not have been the story's original purpose. The distinction is uncomfortable because human beings prefer origins that resemble the meanings they now value. If a story inspires faith today, we assume it was created to inspire faith. If it comforts children, we imagine it was written for children. But ancient royal literature was not designed for modern Sunday schools. It emerged from struggles over land, succession, national identity, military legitimacy, priestly authority, and dynastic memory. The question is not what a preacher can make the story mean. The question is what the story was built to accomplish in its original political environment. That leads directly to the seventh truth. David and Goliath is not merely an isolated tale of an unlikely victory. It follows a recognizable pattern through which ancient societies constructed the lives of founders and kings. The pattern begins with humble or threatened origins. The future ruler is hidden, rejected, exposed, underestimated, or raised away from power. His low position intensifies the significance of his later ascent. Sargon of Akkad was remembered through a legend in which his mother placed him in a basket and entrusted him to a river. Cyrus the Great was surrounded by traditions of threatened infancy and upbringing away from royal privilege. Other ancient rulers were described as children of obscurity, shepherds, outsiders, or survivors. The details differ. The function remains similar. The ruler's improbable rise proves that ordinary human plans could not prevent his destiny. Opposition becomes evidence of election. Humility becomes the background against which greatness appears. In David's case, the pattern is remarkably complete. He is the youngest brother. He tends animals. His family underestimates him. He enters public history through one impossible achievement. The existing king recognizes his value. He enters the royal household. He marries the king's daughter. He eventually replaces the ruling house. His dynasty becomes the center of national identity. This is not merely the biography of an underdog. It is the architecture of a founding myth. And once we understand the architecture, every previous fracture acquires a new meaning. The seventh truth is not that every detail of David's life must be fictional. Founding myths are rarely created from nothing. They often gather around a historical person, preserving fragments of real conflicts, places, rivals, alliances, and achievements. The important point is that memory has been arranged according to a political template. History supplies material. The template supplies meaning. A historical David may have served as a warrior. He may have risen through Saul's court. He may have fought Philistines, formed alliances, and eventually established control over Jerusalem. But the shepherd boy tradition reshapes that rise into a sacred audition. David enters the valley as though he were being tested before the nation. The soldiers fail. The brothers fail to understand him. The king doubts him. The giant mocks him. Every established structure of power is shown to be blind, frightened, or ineffective. Then the unknown youngest son acts. The victory identifies him before he officially receives the throne. It tells the audience that the real king has already appeared, even though Saul still wears the crown. This is why the narrative is politically potent. It delegitimizes Saul while appearing merely to celebrate David. Saul possesses armor but cannot fight. David rejects the armor and wins. Saul commands an army but cannot inspire it. David arrives from the margins and transforms it. Saul represents visible authority. David represents hidden election. The duel is therefore not only between David and Goliath, it is an implicit judgment between David and Saul. The future king accomplishes what the reigning king cannot. The audience is prepared to accept the transfer of power before the political struggle fully unfolds. This is how narrative can govern emotion before argument begins. The reader does not need to be told directly that David's dynasty deserves legitimacy. The story creates admiration so intense that legitimacy feels self-evident. A child who loves David before learning the later conflicts will interpret those conflicts through loyalty already established. That is the power of an origin story. It determines whom you trust before presenting the evidence. The humble shepherd template intensifies this effect. If David begins as a professional warrior ambitious for power, his later conflict with Saul may look like rivalry. If he begins as an innocent boy reluctantly drawn into history, his ascent appears imposed upon him by destiny. Ambition disappears. Political maneuvering becomes providence. Violence becomes fulfillment. The dynasty's success becomes proof that the dynasty was meant to succeed. This logic was not unique to Israel. Kings throughout the ancient world connected their authority to divine selection, miraculous survival, heroic combat, or signs witnessed before their reign. A ruler who seized power through ordinary struggle needed a story that lifted his family above ordinary judgment. The story told subjects why obedience was not merely practical but sacred. David's shepherd identity serves exactly this purpose. His low origin becomes evidence that no human conspiracy could have created his rise. His brothers did not choose him. Saul did not initially recognize him. The army did not expect him. The enemy dismissed him. Only God saw what others could not. Therefore, the kingdom belongs to David, not because he successfully acquired it, but because it had always belonged to him in the unseen order. This is dynastic theology. The giant's increased height strengthens it. A taller Goliath makes the sign more dramatic. The second introduction strengthens it. An unknown David makes recognition more miraculous. Saul's confusion strengthens it. The king's blindness contrasts with divine sight. The Jerusalem reference strengthens it. The victory is symbolically connected to the future capital. Even the tension between warrior and shepherd serves the dynasty. David possesses every natural qualification while also appearing to transcend natural explanation. The seams are not random flaws surrounding an otherwise neutral story. They mark the points where political memory was expanded into sacred legend. The editors did not always conceal the joins, because ancient readers may not have expected modern historical consistency. Preserving respected traditions could be more important than forcing them into one perfectly harmonized chronology. One community remembered David the warrior. Another cherished David the shepherd. A later collection honored both. Over time, readers forgot they were looking at layers. The combined form acquired the appearance of unity simply because it had been transmitted as a single sacred chapter. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates authority. Authority creates the illusion that the text could never have existed differently. But the older manuscripts remain. Elhanan remains. The shorter Goliath remains. The warrior David remains. The unconquered Jerusalem remains. They are like stones protruding through the surface of a later road, revealing that another path lies underneath. Spinoza's contribution was to teach readers not to fear such evidence. For him, understanding the human production of Scripture did not require contempt for Scripture. It required liberation from superstition. A text could contain moral insight, political memory, literary beauty, and philosophical value without being the direct, uniform composition of an unchanging divine voice. The danger begins when human documents are removed from history and used as instruments of unquestionable authority. Once a political narrative is declared sacred, the power interests within it become difficult to expose. The commands of past rulers acquire the aura of eternal necessity. Historical loyalties become divine obligations. Fear protects the arrangement. Readers are warned that questioning the text means questioning God. Doubt becomes guilt. Investigation becomes rebellion. But if God is identical with the infinite order of nature, as Spinoza argued, then evidence cannot threaten God. A manuscript difference is part of nature. A contradiction is part of nature. The human desire to create coherent national memory is part of nature. The scholar who discovers the seam is also part of nature. Truth does not become impious merely because it reveals human causes. What is threatened is not the divine order. What is threatened is the authority of those who claim exclusive control over its interpretation. This distinction allows us to examine David and Goliath without replacing religious certainty with cynical certainty. We need not declare that every event is fabricated. We need not pretend we possess a complete reconstruction of what happened. The evidence does not permit that confidence. What it permits is a more disciplined conclusion. The familiar narrative is composite. It developed through transmission, and its expanded form serves the legitimization of Davidic kingship. That conclusion is strong enough. It explains why the hero becomes humbler, the enemy becomes larger, the recognition becomes more dramatic, and the future capital enters the story before its conquest. It also explains why the story remained important long after the dynasty itself had fallen. A political myth can survive the political system that produced it. It can be inherited by new religions, new nations, and new institutions. Its original function may be forgotten, while its emotional machinery continues operating. The story of David becomes essential to later expectations of messianic descent. Genealogies connect future claims to his house. The legitimacy once constructed for one dynasty becomes part of the foundation for another theological structure. The machine continues because each generation discovers a new use for it. The royal audition becomes a lesson in faith. The national founder becomes a universal spiritual symbol. The dynastic victory becomes a metaphor for every private struggle. Yet beneath all these later meanings, the earlier political function remains visible. The story tells its original audience. This family did not rise by accident. This family was selected. This family's authority reflects the will of God. That is not merely encouragement. It is propaganda in the oldest and most sophisticated sense, a narrative designed to shape public perception of power. And realizing this may produce something deeper than intellectual surprise. It may produce grief. The grief arrives quietly. It is not always the dramatic collapse of belief. Sometimes, it is only the recognition that a story carried since childhood had another purpose before it became personal. You thought David and Goliath had been given to you as a lesson in courage. Now you see that its earlier form may have helped establish the legitimacy of a king and his descendants. You thought the shepherd boy stood outside politics. Now you see that his innocence may have been politically necessary. You thought the giant's extraordinary height proved the magnitude of faith. Now you know that older textual witnesses describe a smaller opponent. You thought the chapter unfolded as one continuous eyewitness account. Now you see two introductions, two portraits of David, different manuscript lengths, conflicting killers, and a geographical detail that belongs more naturally to a later period. This recognition can feel like loss. The mind may immediately search for escape. Perhaps every contradiction has a hidden resolution. Perhaps the manuscripts can be harmonized. Perhaps the scholars are exaggerating. Perhaps questioning the story threatens something larger that must be defended. These reactions are understandable. An inherited belief is rarely an isolated proposition. It is connected to parents, teachers, childhood safety, community, music, ritual, and the desire to belong. When the belief changes, those relationships seem to tremble with it. But understanding does not require contempt for the people who taught you. Most parents did not compare the Septuagint with the Masoretic text. Most Sunday school teachers had never studied the Elhanan passage in Hebrew. Most people who arranged the feltboard figures were repeating a story they sincerely believed would give children courage. They were not architects of the system. They were participants within it. Spinoza's philosophy helps us move beyond the desire to blame. Every person acts through causes. The teacher was shaped by a church. The church was shaped by a theological tradition. The tradition was shaped by institutions, political needs, translations, inherited commentaries, and centuries of repetition. Understanding this chain does not remove responsibility, but it replaces hatred with clarity. Anger sees only the nearest cause. Reason traces the sequence. The more completely we understand the sequence, the less we are controlled by blind reaction. This is what freedom means within a world of causes. Freedom is not the magical power to exist outside nature. It is not the ability to choose without influence, history, emotion, or condition. Freedom is the movement from passive determination toward active understanding. When you repeat a story only because it was repeated to you, you are being carried by causes you do not recognize. When you examine the story, compare its forms, identify its political function, and consciously decide what meaning, if any, you still accept, you become more active. You do not escape causality. You understand more of it. That understanding changes your relationship to the story. Perhaps you will no longer teach David and Goliath as literal evidence that faith can suspend natural limits. Perhaps you will teach it as an example of how societies create heroic founders. Perhaps you will preserve its imagery as literature while explaining its textual history. Perhaps you will see in David not a supernatural exception, but a figure constructed from memories of warfare, court politics, national longing, and theological interpretation. Whatever conclusion you reach, it should arise from examination rather than fear. Look again at the 7 fractures. One passage attributes Goliath's death to Elhanan. A later passage redirects Elhanan's victory toward an otherwise unknown brother of Goliath. The older manuscript witnesses give the Philistine a height near 6 feet 9 inches, while the later Masoretic tradition raises him toward 10 feet. Saul knows David in one chapter and fails to recognize him in the next. A shorter Greek version lacks many of the verses that produce the contradiction. The story sends Goliath's head to Jerusalem before David has conquered the city. David appears first as a man of war, and then as a youth considered unfit for combat. Finally, the shepherd narrative follows a widespread royal pattern: humble origins, family rejection, extraordinary victory, royal recognition, marriage into the ruling house, ascent to the throne, and the establishment of a dynasty. Placed separately, each difficulty may appear manageable. Placed together, they reveal a process. The story was layered, expanded, harmonized, symbolized, and transmitted. The giant grew because a greater obstacle produced a greater sign. The shepherd emerged because humble origins strengthened divine election. The king forgot David because the second origin story required first recognition. Jerusalem received the trophy because later national memory pulled David's victory toward the sacred capital. Elhanan lost the achievement because royal heroes attract the deeds of obscure warriors. None of this requires a secret conspiracy involving every teacher who ever repeated the story. Systems do not survive only through deliberate deception. They survive because certain narratives are useful. The polished story works. It is memorable. It turns political legitimacy into emotional identification. It allows the listener to place himself inside the hero's body. You are David. Your fear is Goliath. Your faith is the sling. Your problem is the giant that must fall. That interpretation travels easily because it speaks to genuine human vulnerability. But its usefulness should not prevent us from recognizing its history. A beautiful symbol may still be a constructed symbol. An inspiring lesson may still rest upon a narrative shaped for power. The moment of disillusionment, therefore, contains a possibility. You can grieve the story you thought you had without returning to intellectual childhood. You can thank the people who gave it to you without pretending they gave you the whole history. You can recognize that a text contains human struggle without dismissing every question it raises about courage, fear, authority, and identity. Most importantly, you can learn to count the seams elsewhere. How many stories about nations, leaders, companies, religions, and families have been arranged to make existing power appear inevitable? How many rulers present humble beginnings as proof that destiny selected them? How often does a community enlarge its enemies so that its own violence appears heroic? How many institutions hide textual complexity because simplicity preserves obedience? And how many beliefs in your own life remain unquestioned only because they were placed inside you before you had the ability to examine them? These questions extend far beyond David and Goliath. The story becomes a lesson after all, but not necessarily the lesson you were first given. It teaches how legends absorb history. It teaches how political authority becomes sacred memory. It teaches how repetition can disguise contradiction. It teaches how emotional usefulness can protect a claim from investigation. And it teaches that intellectual freedom begins when you stop asking whether a question is permitted and begin asking whether the evidence supports the answer. That freedom is not comfortable. Spinoza never promised comfort. Understanding may separate you from familiar certainties. It may change how you hear sermons, read sacred texts, or speak with people you love. It may expose how often fear has been mistaken for reverence. But confusion does not become peace merely because it is protected. Real peace comes from seeing causes more clearly. The grief you feel when an inherited story changes is not proof that you have become empty, bitter, or lost. It may be the sensation of the mind releasing an illusion it once needed. It may be the cost of moving from passive belief toward active understanding. So consider the 7 fractures carefully. Which one changed the story most completely for you? Was it the name of Elhanan? The changing height of Goliath? The king who could not recognize his armor-bearer? The missing portions of the older version? The journey to an unconquered Jerusalem? The warrior transformed into a shepherd? Or the discovery that the entire narrative follows the structure of a royal founding myth? Share the point at which the story opened for you not to perform disbelief, but to make examination possible for someone else. And consider sending this exploration to the person who has sensed the contradiction, but never found language for it. The friend who began asking questions. The sibling who still fears them, or the parent deciding how to present this story to a child. Because once you learn to notice how a sacred narrative was assembled, the method does not remain confined to one chapter. You begin to examine the genealogies built upon David's dynasty. You begin to compare the competing ancestral lines attached to Jesus. You begin to ask why different gospel traditions provide different names, different sequences, and different theological purposes. One seam leads to another. Not because truth is disappearing, but because the illusion of effortless certainty is finally giving way to understanding. And once the mind has learned to count the seams, it rarely agrees to stop.